They called her useless, too frail for the fields, too plain for a dowry, too quiet to matter. Cast from her family's hearth, she wandered hungry, her name spoken only with shame. But high in the mountains, where the wind howled through pines and men lived with ghosts, one solitary figure saw in her not weakness, but a flame worth tending. He built her a cabin with his own hands, laid down a place by the fire, and called her wife. What followed was not just survival, but a love that defied every cruel word ever spoken against her and shook the judgment of those who had abandoned her. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a ride into the Old West. The trail wound steep and narrow through the pines, the earth hard with frost that cracked beneath their boots, and though her legs ached with each climb, the girl pressed on, her breath coming in quick clouds that dissolved into the cold air, her spirit clinging fiercely to the faint promise that she was walking not toward another rejection but toward something she had never known, a place where she might belong. Ahead of her, the rugged man moved with the surety of one who had walked these paths 100 times, his shoulders broad beneath the worn hide of his coat, his stride steady, unyielding, and though he spoke little, his presence carved a space in the wild that felt almost like safety, as though the mountain itself bent around him. She stumbled once on a loose stone, her hand scraping against the icy ground, and before she could rise on her own, he turned back, his rough hand steadying her not with impatience but with a quiet care that caught her breath in her throat, for it had been long since anyone had touched her without judgment. The cold bit through her thin dress, searing her skin like needles, yet with every step higher into the ridges, every gust of wind that tangled her hair and numbed her fingers, she felt something stir inside her, a fragile flame, one that no jeer from her family, no cold dismissal from the town, had ever managed to extinguish, now flickering brighter against the mountain air. The pines rose like sentinels around them, their boughs heavy with frost, their trunks whispering secrets in the wind, and she thought of how she had been cast out, told she was too frail for field work, too plain to wed, too quiet to notice, and yet here, where the land itself seemed to test her with each step, she felt a strange and defiant strength, as if belonging was not measured in beauty or dowry, but in the will to keep climbing. The man glanced back now and again, his eyes steady, not pitying but weighing her resolve, and though his words were few, the set of his jaw and the care with which he slowed his pace to match hers told her more than any speech could that he had chosen her, not as a burden, but as someone worth leading through these wild and unforgiving trails. The sky stretched wide above them, a pale expanse streaked with the last embers of daylight, and the peaks loomed higher still, sharp and solemn, as though daring her to prove her place among them. She drew her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders, teeth chattering, yet in her chest she carried the warmth of something long denied, purpose. Each step upward was no longer only survival but a defiance against every cruel word her kin had thrown at her, every laugh that had cut her down, every silence that had left her forgotten. And with every mile of rough trail she passed behind her, she felt those voices dim, replaced by the rhythm of her own breath, the crunch of frost beneath her feet, and the quiet certainty of the man's presence just ahead. When at last they paused at a ridge where the valley stretched vast below, she stood trembling, exhausted, but as she looked out over the endless sprawl of forest and sky, she felt the weight of her past fall away, scattered to the wind, and for the first time, she did not feel useless or cast aside. She felt carried, not by his hand alone, but by the stubborn flame within her that refused to die. And as they turned to continue deeper into the mountains, her spirit burned with the quiet, unshakable knowledge that whatever waited at the end of this ascent, it would be hers to claim. The days that followed blurred into a rhythm of labor and breath, the wilderness ringing with the sound of axe on wood and hammer against stone, each strike reverberating through the crisp mountain air, as if the man were not only raising a cabin but carving defiance into the earth itself. With rough, calloused hands, he split logs thick as her waist, his shoulders heaving beneath the strain, sweat steaming from his brow even in the cold, and with each blow of the axe she felt the echo settle deep in her chest, like a drumbeat pushing back against the voices that had once declared her useless, too frail to endure, too plain to matter. He stacked the logs with a craftsman's patience, shaping walls from timbers as though willing the wilderness to accept their presence, and when the stones were carried up from the stream bed, one after another, and laid in a hearth that would one day warm their nights, she stood in silence, her hands pressed to her lips. For the sight was more than a man building a shelter, it was a declaration that she, cast aside by kin, forgotten by a world that measured worth in beauty and dowry, was worth the labor of a home raised by sweat and steel. Each hammer strike rang like a challenge hurled into the wind, a rebuttal to every jeer she had ever endured. And as she watched, her heart began to stitch itself with threads she had thought long unraveled, weaving together a fragile tapestry of hope that trembled in her chest. She gathered what small tasks she could, fetching water, gathering kindling, smoothing the bark from smaller poles, and though her hands were clumsy at first, the man never mocked nor dismissed her, only nodded with a quiet approval that warmed her more than any fire yet could. The cabin grew before her eyes, log by log, until its shadow stood proud against the trees, its roof pitched sharp to hold back the snow, its doorway a frame not only for a house but for a life. And when the last stone of the hearth was set and the chimney rose stout above the roofline, she felt tears sting her eyes, for it was the first place in all the world that had been shaped with her in mind, not as burden, not as charity, but as something claimed and kept. At night, as they sat before the open sky with the skeleton of the cabin rising dark behind them, she wrapped her shawl close and let the crackle of his fire wash over her, her gaze fixed on the outline of walls that would soon shield her from the cold, and her thoughts whispered softly, though she did not dare speak them aloud, that perhaps worth was not given by others but grown from the soil of endurance. Perhaps love was not born in ballrooms and dowries but in the steady rhythm of axe and hammer, in the patience of hands that built rather than broke. The man, saying little as always, stared into the flames with eyes that seemed to see farther than the ridges, and she felt the fragile flame within her burn a little brighter, no longer only survival, no longer only defiance, but the first tender flicker of belonging. And as the night deepened and the mountains stood guard around them, she knew the cabin rising from the wilderness was more than wood and stone. It was the mending of a heart that had long been left in ruin, now slowly, steadfastly, stitched back into hope. That night, when the last log had been set into place and the wind outside whispered through the pines like an old hymn, the rugged man struck flint to steel and bent low at the hearth he had built with his own hands, coaxing dry moss and shavings into flame. The spark caught, then spread, licking eagerly across the kindling until the fire leapt to life, its glow spilling against the raw timbers of the cabin, chasing back the shadows that had clung to the corners. She sat on the rough-hewn bench he had shaped for her hands folded in her lap, her heart hammering as the warmth spread across the small space, touching her skin, her bones, her very spirit, and she felt her throat tighten, for this was no grand hall, no parlor dressed in velvet and finery, but it was hers, a place where her presence was not begrudged, where she was not measured and found wanting, where she could sit without flinching from judgment. And in that realization, her tears slipped free. Falling quietly down her cheeks, he glanced toward her, his face lit by firelight, shadows deepening the lines of his jaw. And though he said nothing, he saw the way her shoulders shook, the way her lips trembled, and he did not ask her to explain, did not press her into words she was not ready to speak, but simply placed another log upon the flames and let the crackle of burning wood fill the silence between them. She bowed her head, her tears soaking into the fabric of her sleeve, and for the first time in all her years, they were not tears of shame, not the bitter salt of rejection or ridicule, but tears that tasted almost sweet, born from the tender ache of finding a place where she could exist without apology. Every cruel word her family had spoken, useless, plain, nothing worth keeping, seemed to wither in the glow of that fire, their voices fading against the steady warmth that wrapped around her now. The cabin walls still smelled of sap and stone, rough and new, but to her they smelled of sanctuary, and each flicker of the flame was a promise that she would no longer wander unwanted through the cold. He stoked the fire gently, his hands careful as though the hearth was something sacred, and she realized he had not only built her a cabin, but had given her the gift of dignity, something so long denied she had nearly forgotten it could exist. The fire roared stronger, filling the space with golden light, and she lifted her face at last, her tears drying on her cheeks, her eyes glistening not with sorrow but with a fragile, fierce gratitude. In that moment, She felt the frailty fall away from her shoulders, felt the cold of all those barren years thaw. And though the mountains outside loomed wild and unforgiving, inside the cabin her heart whispered that she was no longer cast out, no longer nameless, but rooted, anchored, seen. The fire crackled as though it understood, and when she closed her eyes and let its warmth soak deep into her, she thought that perhaps this was what it meant to be alive, not merely surviving, but belonging, if only in this small space carved from wilderness and lit by one man's care. Word traveled the way it always did in small settlements, carried not by the ringing of bells or the stamp of hooves, but by the sharper sound of tongues loosed over wash lines, across saloon counters, and in the pews of the church, and soon the town was buzzing with the tale of the outcast girl, the one cast off by her kin as too frail, too plain, too useless, who had somehow found shelter in the cabin of the mountain hermit. To some, it was scandal, fodder for sneers and smirks, for they spoke of impropriety in hushed tones thick with judgment, imagining sin in every shadow cast by pine and firelight. Their eyes narrowed as if the mere thought of her surviving outside the rules they had written for her was an insult to their order. To others, it was proof of their cruelty all along, though they dared not admit it openly. Women who scrubbed their floors and bore their own quiet shames murmured that maybe, just maybe, there was something like grace hidden in those hills, something stronger than the coin and dowry and beauty that had once been used to measure her worth. The preacher, when asked, pressed his lips thin and quoted scripture about the sanctity of marriage and the dangers of straying from community, but his wife, who knew better than to silence her own heart, only bowed her head and prayed a different prayer, one that asked not for punishment but for mercy, for a hearth lit in love, even in the wilderness. The saloon, too, buzzed with talk, men laughing into their whiskey about the hermit taking in a stray, calling her charity, calling her fool's company, while others, those who had lost more than they cared to admit, who carried grief and failure heavy on their backs, stared into their glasses and wondered if perhaps the hermit saw something in her that the rest of them had been too blind, too hardened to see. Children whispered of her like a ghost tale, the girl who had climbed the mountains and vanished into the trees, and though they mocked in daylight, at night when the wind howled through the cracks in their homes, they imagined the cabin fire warming her and felt a pang of envy they could not name. As the story spread, each telling twisted to fit the heart of the teller some weaving scandal, others weaving grace, and though the girl herself knew nothing of their whispers, sitting quietly in the glow of the hearth that had become her sanctuary, she had unknowingly unsettled the town itself, stirring beneath their silence the question none dared speak aloud. What if worth was not decided by fathers and coins, by fields and beauty, but by something simpler, fiercer, hidden away in the hills, where one man had looked at a girl deemed worthless and called her instead a flame worth tending? That question hung unspoken in the hearts of many, pressing against the walls of their judgments. And though most turned away with scorn or laughter, a few found themselves wondering, with a shiver that felt suspiciously like hope, if the mountains did not keep secrets of sin at all, but secrets of grace waiting for those brave enough or desperate enough to climb. The mountain man had always carried his silence like a second skin, and though the girl saw only his sure hands as he split logs and his steady presence beside the fire, inside him lived a wound older and deeper than any scar on his body, a hollow carved the winter his wife had died, buried beneath snow so heavy it had swallowed even the sound of his own cries. She had been the one to walk beside him in the first days of his cabin, before it was more than a skeleton of logs and smoke, her laughter warming the beams while her hands stirred broth over stones blackened by the first fire. And when the fever came, it had burned her as fiercely as that flame, leaving him to dig the grave with numb hands, each shovelful of frozen earth a denial that the world could take her from him. After laying her beneath cairns of stone, he had sworn off tenderness, retreating into the ridges where only hawks and storms could hear him, choosing the solitude of peaks and pines over the risk of another loss, his heart wrapped in silence like bark over a wound, rough and thick but never quite healing. The years that followed blurred into a rhythm of survival hunt, mend, split, build, and though he lived, he did not feel alive, only enduring, only waiting out the days, until the girl came stumbling into his path, half-starved and cast off, her eyes haunted with the same loneliness he had once carried, and something in her broke the rhythm, unsettled the silence, made the old wound ache in ways he had forgotten, because where others had seen weakness he saw a reflection of himself, someone the world had decided was not worth keeping, and in her frailty he recognized not burden but the chance to tend what he had once lost. At night, when she slept near the hearth, her breath rising soft against the dark, he would stare at the ceiling beams and remember the face of the woman he had buried, guilt gnawing at him for feeling hope again, for letting the girl's presence stir embers he had sworn to let die. But with that guilt came the strange, sharp edge of redemption, as if sheltering her, building her a space where she could be more than what cruelty had named her, might in some way honor the love he had failed to protect. Yet the ghost did not leave him easily, and sometimes he woke in the cold hours, sweating and trembling, hearing echoes of fevered coughing, seeing frost biting the lips of the woman who once lay at his side, and he would step outside into the black silence of the mountain, head bowed against the wind, whispering apologies to the stones as if they carried his voice to the grave he could no longer visit. But come dawn, when he saw the girl bent at the goat pen, her hair falling loose as she wrestled with stubborn latches, or watched her stack kindling with hands that had once known only dismissal, he felt the ache of the wound twist into something different, not the pain of loss, but the beginning of healing, a scar knitting itself from within. He knew the choice to take her in was not just mercy, not just kindness, it was a gamble with his own soul, a wager that perhaps love could grow again in soil long left barren, that perhaps protecting her was not only giving her life but reclaiming his own from the shadow of that grave. And as he watched her move through the cabin, unsure yet unyielding, he understood with a quiet, humbled clarity that she was not only the girl the world had thrown away, she was the answer to a vow he had thought forever broken. The chance to lay down the past not by forgetting it but by building something new upon its ashes. And though the wound still ached, it was no longer hollow but filling, slowly, painfully, with the fragile, defiant hope she brought into his silence. Each morning before the first gray stitched a seam along the ridgeline, she rose from the pallet he had framed for her and wrapped herself in the woolen shawl he'd left by the hearth, stepping into the cold that bit like clean steel and made her lungs sharpen with every breath. And though the mountain air once seemed a judge, now it felt like a teacher as she learned its lessons by the day. She began with wood, awkward at first, fingers fumbling the hatchet handle, the head thudding crooked into rounds, so the bark splintered and her palm burned. But the rugged man only showed her once: set the log upright, knees soft, let your hips do the work, don't fight the grain, and after that she practiced until the blade fell with a truer rhythm, her strokes settling into a cadence that matched the crows calling far up the slope. And when a slice of pine sapped her knuckle she did not flinch, only wrapped it in a strip of linen, and kept swinging because the stove would want its due when the evening winds woke. From wood she went to water, following the deer path he'd pointed out, learning where frost slicked the roots and where the creek bent sly around a stand of alder, and she taught herself to dip the bucket low and lift along the leg so her back would last the winter. And she learned to watch the ripple for trout, not to catch them yet but to know they were there, silver promises for a leaner day. The goats tested her patience, first nosing at her pockets, stamping, huffing when the latch stuck, yet she studied their small, horned tempers the way she once studied the color of soap, and soon she could milk the old doe without a kick, her hands gentling to a squeeze and release that brought a soft stream, warm as breath, into the tin pail, while kids nibbled her skirt and she laughed, surprised to hear the sound in her own throat, unused to the way joy arrived in work. She mended, too, not with fine-town stitches but with long, grateful ones that held the strap of his pack, the tear in her hem, the fray in a sling he used for hauling stones, and each pass of the needle felt like a seam running through herself, drawing the tattered edges closer. He showed her how to read the mountain's face without words, how the raven's line meant a carcass on the far slope, how the hush that falls at noon can mean a cat shadowing the brush, how the smell of iron in the wind tells of snow before the clouds confess it, and she began keeping her own small ledger in memory. 3 cords stacked by the north wall, 6 jars of goat's milk thickened over the fire. A braid of onions hung where the smoke will kiss them dry. In the afternoons she spread a cloth on the step, sorting spruce tips for tea and scraping lichen from a fallen rock the way his first wife had taught him long ago. He did not speak her name, but the care with which he handled those old lessons placed the woman gently between them. And as sunlight sank narrow through the pines, she swept the floor they'd made from planed boards, counting it a wonder that a space could start as forest and end as a room where her footsteps had the right to ring. Sometimes she failed. The bread burned when the wind shifted and stoked the coals too fierce. The snare snapped empty because she scented it wrong. The goat found the only hole in the fence and chewed the last of the clothespins, and each failure used to be a verdict in her old life. Another chorus of useless stitched into her skin. Yet here failure was only a page to turn. And when she came red-eyed to the door, he handed her the length of twine or the tin of salt or, once, nothing at all, only a nod that said, "Try again." And she did. And the second bread rose, and the next snare held, and the patched fence kept. Her body toughened without cruelty, muscles stringing across her forearms where once there had been only the tremor of hunger. Her steps remembering each root and rock so she no longer stumbled but flowed along the path. And her voice, which had used itself for apologies all her life, found other words short and plain at first. Wood stacked, milk's cooled, sky smells like weather. Then longer, if we move the pen to the lee. The does won't freeze when the creek wind rises. And he listened as if every syllable were worth the air it cost. When dusk fell and she laid kindling in a careful teepee and coaxed fire with a breath she was no longer afraid to spend, she sat on the bench he'd made and felt the day gather inside her like warmth behind rib and sternum. And she understood with a start that she had crossed some invisible line. She was not a mouth to feed, but a pair of hands the cabin required. Not a pity sheltered beneath a man's charity, but a partner the mountain had admitted. Her old names, frail, plain, useless, tried to find her in the doorway some nights, tugging at her shawl like cold fingers from the valley. Yet the goats bleated for her, the pans waited for her, the fire answered her breath, and the man's eyes, steady and unworried, met hers as though she had always been expected. With each dawn she woke not into fear but into tasks that braided with purpose. And while the settlement below argued over scandal and sin, up here a truth too simple for their tongues took root. She was needed, not as ornament or bargain, but as herself, hands strong, eyes bright, heart steady as the mountain that now, unmistakably, called her by name. The sheriff came at dusk, his horse's hooves crunching the frost-hardened ground as the shadows lengthened across the ridge, the sound breaking the cabin's quiet like a drumbeat of unease. And when the rugged man stepped out to meet him, axe still in hand from the wood he had been splitting, he found the lawman sitting tall in the saddle, hat brim pulled low, eyes glinting with that particular mixture of weariness and warning that spoke louder than his words. The sheriff did not dismount, only shifted the reins and said in a voice rough with smoke and distance that the mountain was no place to plant a scandal, that tongues in town had already curled around the story of a cast-off girl taken in by a hermit, and that her family, the same kin who had branded her useless and driven her out, were now spitting fire at the thought of her finding footing, muttering that if she were allowed to rise from the dust they had ground her into, their own cruelty would be laid bare for all to see. The man listened, his jaw tight, his gaze steady, while beside him the girl stood in the doorway, half hidden but not deaf, her fingers curled against the wood as if to anchor herself against the chill that rose in her chest. The sheriff went on, speaking with the cadence of one who pretends neutrality but carries the weight of favors owed, warning that her kin had coin enough and spite enough to stir the valley against them, that a woman branded worthless who dared to prove her worth was a danger to the order they lived by, and that sheltering her was not mercy but defiance against the way things had always been. The rugged man shifted the axe in his grip, not threatening, only grounding himself in the feel of wood and iron, and though his reply was few words, low and graveled, they carried the iron of conviction, that his cabin was his own, his hearth his own, and the girl who warmed it no one's to command but herself. The sheriff's mouth tightened, his mustache twitching as though he wanted to spit into the dirt but thought better of it, and he leaned forward in the saddle, his voice dropping sharper. "You'll bring trouble on your head, old friend. Trouble with more teeth than you care to reckon. Men don't forgive what they can't control, and women don't rise without someone wanting to drag them back down." The girl felt her heart hammer at the words, felt the old echo of shame clamor to life, yet she pressed her shoulders back and stood straighter, letting the firelight from within the cabin catch her face so the sheriff could see she was not cowering, and though her lips did not move, the defiance in her eyes was answer enough. For a moment the lawman seemed unsettled, his gaze flicking from her to the man, to the cabin itself with its smoke curling stubbornly into the evening sky, a sign of life the valley had tried to snuff, and he muttered that he had given his warning and would give no more, then turned his horse with a tug of the reins and rode off down the trail, the sound of hooves fading into the whisper of the pines. Silence stretched long after, broken only by the crackle of the fire inside and the low call of an owl. And the man lowered his axe, staring into the woods where the sheriff had vanished, while the girl, her pulse still racing, stepped out onto the frost and stood beside him, her breath clouding in the cold, her voice at last breaking the quiet with a whisper steady and sharp. "They want me gone because they're afraid I'll prove them wrong." And in her words he heard not only fear but the flint of truth, a spark that would burn brighter still, and as he laid a steadying hand on her shoulder, he knew that whatever trouble the sheriff promised was already on its way. But so too was her rising, and the mountain itself seemed to lean closer, listening to the reckoning yet to come. They came at dawn, 3 shadows cresting the ridge with rifles slung across their backs in fury burning hot in their eyes. Her brothers, the same blood that once shared her father's hearth, the same voices that had jeered useless until the word was carved into her bones, now rode hard against the mountain as if the land itself owed them her return. And the girl watched from the cabin's narrow window as the frost cracked beneath their horses' hooves, her breath tight but her hands clenched, because she knew in their coming was no love, no kinship, only the demand that she return to the chains they had forged with scorn. The mountain man was already at the doorway when they reined up, his shoulders filling the frame, his axe laid aside for the rifle he held steady but lowered, not raised, his stance calm yet immovable, a wall of resolve as unshakable as the timbers of the cabin he had built for her. The eldest brother spat into the snow, voice thick with contempt, declaring that she had shamed them all by running to the arms of a hermit, that their family name was dragged through dirt while she hid in the hills, and that she would come down with them whether willing or not, for they would not allow her rising to expose their cruelty. The second brother laughed, a sharp, bitter sound, saying that she was weak, still the same girl they had cast out, and that no man could polish a stone that was already cracked. While the youngest, his eyes darting, less certain, shifted in his saddle as if the mountain air itself unsettled him, yet he echoed the others, because to be silent was to betray them. The man at the doorway let them finish, his face carved from stone, and when he spoke, his words were few but fierce, telling them that she was no burden, no shame, no possession to be traded or reclaimed, that she had a place here because she had earned it, because she had chosen it, and no rifle or blood tie would change that. They bristled, hands twitching near their weapons, but before their rage could spill into violence, the door creaked open wider, and the girl stepped forward into the cold, the firelight spilling around her like a crown, her thin shawl whipping in the wind, her cheeks flushed not from fear but from resolve, and for the first time in her life she faced them without bowing her head. Her voice, steady and clear as mountain water, carried across the yard. "I will never belong to your scorn again. You cast me out. You named me worthless. And now you come because you see I am more than the names you gave me. But I am not yours to claim, not yours to shame, not yours to drag back into the dust. I belong here by my own work, my own hands, my own choice, and nothing you carry, not your rifles, not your pride, can take that from me." The words struck sharper than bullets, cutting through their bluster, and for a heartbeat even the eldest faltered, his sneer wavering as he looked at the sister he had thought broken, and found instead a woman rooted like stone, her flame blazing where they had tried to snuff it. The mountain man did not move, only shifted his stance to stand with her rather than before her, and together they faced the brothers, the line drawn as clear as dawnlight on the ridge. The wind carried her defiance into the pines, and the forest seemed to hold its breath, and though her brothers still sat with rifles and rage, something in the mountain itself had turned, whispering that blood alone could not bind what contempt had broken, and that whatever came next, she would never again be theirs to command. The air was so sharp it seemed to cut with every breath, and for a long moment after her words fell into the snow-laden silence, her brothers did not move, did not speak, their mouths parted but no jeer finding purchase, because what struck them was not the rifle steady in the mountain man's grip, but the fire in their sister's voice, a blaze they had never reckoned with, a blaze they had mocked for years as embers they thought too weak to spark. Yet here she stood, framed by the doorway of the cabin, her shawl pulled close but her chin unbowed, her voice ringing with the authority of one who had at last shed the weight of their scorn, and it was as though the mountain itself echoed her declaration, the pines whispering with the wind, the snow crunching beneath the restless hooves of their horses, every sound amplifying the truth. They had denied that she was no burden, no shadow, trailing behind their pride, but a woman who had carved her own worth in the wild. She had fed goats with her own hands, split logs until her palms blistered, mended fences that held through storm, coaxed fire from stone and breath, and in those acts, she had built a life that no dowry, no field, no cruel word could diminish. The eldest brother, his face twisted with pride, more brittle than stone, tried to sneer, tried to spit that she had been nothing when they cast her out, but his voice caught, thinned, because even he could see the lie splintering under her unflinching gaze. The second, always the louder mocker, opened his mouth to laugh, but no sound came, because her silence, her refusal to bow, her refusal to break was louder than any ridicule he could muster. And the youngest, his knuckles pale on the reins, looked at her with something close to fear, or perhaps shame, for though he echoed his brother's cruelty before, now he saw in her what they had all refused to admit, that their casting out had not destroyed her but honed her, like iron tempered in fire. Behind her, the mountain man stood firm, but he was no longer her shield, he was her witness, the solid proof that her defiance came not from his strength, but from her own. And as the wind rose, tugging at her hair, her voice cut once more through the air, low but fierce. I do not need your name to have worth. I do not need your hearth to have home. I have made both with my hands, and I will not return to chains of shame. And the words struck them harder than any bullet could, for in them was the truth that shattered the long silence she had carried like a yoke. It was the silence of all women who had bowed their heads beneath judgment, the silence of a family that had thought her weakness made them strong, and it broke there in the shadow of the cabin, split wide open by the fire she would no longer hide. The brothers shifted uneasily, their rifles hanging useless across their shoulders, for what power could weapons hold against a woman who had faced the wilderness, faced hunger and cold, faced their cruelty, and stood unbroken? None of them spoke again, for in her defiance they saw not rebellion but reckoning, and the snow fell softer around them as if the mountain itself approved, and though they might ride away still angry, still bitter, they could no longer deny that she had claimed her place, not in their hearth, but in her own, carved from wood and stone in the fierce, unyielding truth of her worth. When dawn broke over the peaks, the first rays of sunlight spilling gold across the snow, and setting the pines aglow like cathedral pillars, the cabin stood not just as a shelter of logs and stone but as a testament, a symbol hammered and stitched into being by two souls. The world had tried to cast aside, one broken by grief, the other by scorn, and in that fragile but defiant union, the frontier itself bore witness to a truth too sharp to be denied, that exile could become love, that ruin could give way to strength, that a girl once branded useless could stand unshaken at the threshold of her own home. Word of the clash with her brothers had already seeped down the valley, carried by riders and whispers, so that when the first townsfolk lifted their eyes toward the mountains that morning, they did not see only ridges and frost, but a fire lit in rumor, the outcast who had defied her blood, the hermit who had defied the lawman, the cabin that had defied silence, and though some sneered still, muttering that scandal was no miracle, many more found their hearts uneasy, for they could no longer reconcile the story they had told themselves of her frailty, with the vision of her standing in the doorway, shawl whipping in the wind, voice steady as the earth beneath her feet. Women who had pitied her now felt something different, something like pride, as if her defiance had cracked a silence too many of them bore, and men who had once scoffed at her plainness found themselves measuring worth by a different rule, one carved not in dowries but in endurance, not in beauty but in flame. The preacher, forced to reckon with the murmurs that filled his pews, stood at his pulpit and spoke of how the Lord sometimes chose the weak to shame the strong. But his wife, when she heard the story told among the women gathered at Wash, whispered that it was not weakness at all but the strength that had always been hers. Only now the world had no choice but to see it. even the sheriff, his pockets lined with coin and his badge heavy with debts, felt the weight of what had happened on the ridge. For a woman whom law and family had both discarded now stood freer than most who claimed power in town, and he knew that her rising had set a precedent no warning could erase. The girl herself, scarred by words that would never fully fade, did not see herself as symbol but simply as alive. Her hands roughened by labor, her back strong from work, her spirit no longer bowed, and when she sat by the hearth that morning, the fire she had coaxed into life herself crackling bright, she felt no shame in the tears that came, for they were not born of sorrow, but of recognition that she had been broken, yes, but not destroyed, that she had been cast out, yes, but had found in exile the truest belonging, that love had found her not in silks or coin, but in the steady hands of a man who saw her flame and tended it until it blazed. The cabin, and rising stark against the mountainside, became a beacon no one had expected, proof that the frontier, harsh and unforgiving, did not exist only to crush but could also transform, could take the ones the world called useless and show them stronger than those who mocked them. And so the settlement below, once quick to scorn, once eager to sneer, now found themselves forced to reckon with what the mountain had revealed, that worth is not given by fathers or brothers, not bought in coins or measured in beauty, but carved in defiance, fed by love, and witnessed by the wild itself. And though tongues would still wag and men would still sneer, none could deny that from exile had risen a woman who made the broken whole, and that her cabin on the ridge stood as dawn's brightest truth against their darkest silence.